Hi everyone, today I'm going to critique and discuss the book Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. I will then give you a detailed summary of the book in plain English. So if you watch this video, you'll have a pretty good idea of what Mark Fisher says in the book, better than if you watch any other video out there. I've seen some of them, I've read some of the book reviews, and the vast majority of people who read this book didn't read it carefully, they didn't reread it, they didn't take the time. They usually just gloss over it, maybe a few phrases here and there resonate with them, and then they just walk away with an incomplete picture. Every book summary I saw, even the ones purporting to be faithful to the book, had huge parts missing. I promise I've done my best to summarize his points. I had to read and reread multiple passages until they all made sense. I'm not omitting anything. Having said that, I will warn you that I absolutely hated this book. I can't believe I fell for this meme. My criticisms are pretty harsh. I critique it here in the intro. I critique it while I'm summarizing it, while I'm explaining it, and I critique it at the end of each chapter. So word of warning, word to the wise, I'm going to be harsh on it. Why did I hate this book? First of all, it's really overrated. When you actually read and comb the book for the points he's trying to make, you realize it's nothing new, nothing insightful, nothing original, and yet people can't shut up about it. Second, and probably what annoyed me the most, was how confusing it is. The vernacular is overtly confusing. It's a postmodernist book, which means he's purposefully writing everything in the most confusing way. Even Zizek isn't as confusing as this guy, Mark Fisher. There were lots of places where he could have easily explained himself better by just throwing in one or two examples, but he wouldn't, and that's just the thing. It's not mind-blowing points he's making, not mind-blowing examples. He just wrote a really fancy-sounding book, which is another problem I had with it. All his examples revolve around education. The guy's a teacher, but he's also writing a philosophy book on our postmodernist zeitgeist. What are the odds that every single one of his examples revolves around education? Like, can you apply market Stalinism to anything other than being a teacher? Which reminds me of another thing. He complains about the dumbest crap. Like, to him, if your boss tells you to make your performance reviews more critical, that's analogous to Maoist confessionalism. If students sit at their desk with good posture, that's an example of the control society. And if they slouch at their desk, that's also an example of the control society. If your students don't like reading, why, that's because of late capitalism. If you go watch a Pixar movie with your kids, that's bad. It's called interpassivity. If your accountant has to keep up with the latest tax laws, well, that's post-Fordism. Poor guy can't just become complacent in his job. And I like how he compares the most menial crap, like filling out a performance review, to Maoism, something that killed millions of people. What a joke. In his world, if manufacturers charge like $20 for pills to treat bipolar disorder, why, they're commoditizing and naturalizing mental illness. God forbid. Which reminds me of another thing. A lot of people like and even praise this book because he emphasizes the need to blame a rise in mental illness to capitalism. First of all, the study he references that links the two is complete baloney, as I explain more in that chapter 5. And second of all, that's not exactly what he was saying. It was more transparent than that. It was more nefarious than that. He was very consciously trying to politicize something that wasn't political, and preempting detractors by saying that if you disagree with him trying to politicize mental illness, why, you're naturalizing mental illness. So you see, you're the one who's wrong. I mean, it was so bad, and it's such a classic Marxist move to blame everything, even natural things like the sky being blue, on capitalism. They blame everything. That's their strategy, in case you haven't noticed. That's what critical theory means. And that's exactly what he does. No surprise there. Like a good Marxist, he blames everything on capitalism. In her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, Ayn Rand makes the point that whenever you hear a leftist paint a picture of a grim existence full of traps and pitfalls, where humans are doomed and everything is bad and everything is evil, what the leftists are really doing is revealing their own psychology. And I would say that really applies to this book. Mark Fisher's emphasis on mental illness, for example, was clearly due to himself suffering from mental illness. When he complains about post-Fordism, it's really him complaining about his own job. Like, that's all his examples were in his own job. My favorite example is when his boss was just like, hey man, work smarter, not harder. And I can only imagine him going to his blog, writing about that, sulking over his keyboard, and writing about how comments are like those are indicative of post-Fordism labor disputes. Like, come on, dude, it's just a job. Like, what are you complaining about? But that's the essence of the problem. He didn't do research. He did me search. Anyways, that's my critique, and I promise you, even though you're clearly going to see I read this book, I did make an effort to be accurate, to accurately portray his beliefs. I'm not distorting them or anything. So the summary, which I'm going to give you, it's a detailed summary. That's why this video is long. It's going to be accurate, and it's going to be complete. It's not just going to be the first few chapters. So anyways, I hope you enjoy, and it's all chapter by chapter in plain English. So in terms of a general overview, this book is about a concept he calls capitalist realism. It's a term coined previously back in the 1960s, which he's trying to build on. I would describe it as a nihilistic, bleak view of the world, in other words, realism, brought about by not being able to imagine an alternative to capitalism. He explicitly describes it as, quote, a pervasive atmosphere conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action, end of quote. He starts out every chapter with some movie or book reference illustrating the concept he's trying to explain, which is actually kind of fun. I like that part about this book. He had some good analyses on the literature he referenced. So he starts out the first chapter mentioning the movie Children of Men, pointing out three pretty interesting things about the movie. Number one, that it's a post-apocalyptic movie about a bleak future, but without any apocalyptic event. Democracy wasn't toppled. Capitalism wasn't toppled. It's a bleak world with concentration camps, but coffee shops still exist. The world just fizzled into a grim future, and so the point is a quote he got from Slavoj Žižek. Quote, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, end of quote. The second thing is that the whole plot of the movie, so it's a dystopian future where nobody in the world can have any kids anymore. So he says that the sterility in the plot is actually symbolic. It symbolizes humanity's inability to imagine new things. We are now incapable of imagining an alternative to capitalism. Number three, in the movie there was a room for the ruling class that was full of cultural relics. Michelangelo's David, Picasso's Guernica, Pink Floyd's Inflatable Pig. So the idea, he explains, is that you can have a really controversial painting that was totally revolutionary in its day, but when it loses its sting, when time passes and it stops being revolutionary, it becomes a relic that's just retired into a museum. That's what our culture has become. We have put our culture into a museum because it's now incapable of being revolutionary. In our culture, things that used to be controversial or important have lost their oomph because they've been given price tags and placed on supermarket shelves. Pornography, Das Kapital, religious statues, everything has a price tag on it now. Marx and Engels wrote that capitalism drowned everything in egotistical cold calculation. Capitalism effectively protects us from fanaticism. Capitalism protects us from that problematic thing we call belief, believing in something. So capitalism is what remains when all beliefs have collapsed, and the only thing that remains is the consumer as a spectator. By the way, as a side note, he's like the 1,000th lefty who's complained about this. They call it commoditization. If I had a nickel for every Marxist who complains about commoditization. But I digress. He goes on to quote Badiou, who sort of mocks people who say that capitalism is better than Stalinism. Quote, yeah, we let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but at least we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats like with machetes like they do in Rwanda. End of quote. Yeah, guys, we totally let Africans die of AIDS. We totally haven't spent $90 billion trying to treat AIDS in Africa and have successfully reduced AIDS in South Africa by a third. Totally haven't done that, you guys. He finishes the chapter explaining the differences between this term capitalist realism and just plain old vanilla postmodernism, as theorized by Jameson, a guy he quotes a lot in the book. First of all, when Jameson theorized it, the USSR was still around, so there was still an alternative to capitalism. Nowadays, there is no alternative to capitalism. Second of all, postmodernism fought against modernism, while capitalist realism absorbs modernism and incorporates it every once in a while. An example he gives is surrealist art being used in advertising. But note, when it does, it only does it as a relic, not something to be taken seriously. The third distinction is that late capitalism has encompassed the world so tightly that it has preempted dissent. In other words, it's made designated areas for people to dissent, like alternative music or independent films. And he gives a number of examples. For example, Kurt Cobain talked about how he could not stop being a cliché. If he was anti-establishment, it was because he was scripted to act anti-establishment. The most MTV thing he can do would be rebel against MTV. He felt like he couldn't come up with new, authentic music. Even when he rebelled, it was following a script. Another example. In rap music, to say that you should get real is no longer about real as in reality. To get real means to realize that you're in a dog-eat-dog world where you're either a winner or a loser, but most people will be losers. The third and fourth example are the neo-noir, so detective, police, criminals, comic books of Frank Miller and the novels of James Ellroy, where realism means so much cruelty, betrayal, and savagery that it becomes normal. The parallel he draws is the Reagan-Bush supersaturation of corruption that is so corrupt that the American people stop being shocked and outraged and interested by it. Chapter 2. Capitalism is so ubiquitous that anti-capitalism is embedded in capitalism. In other words, in a lot of Hollywood movies, the bad guy is an evil businessman or an evil corporation like the Pixar movie WALL-E. This isn't a threat to capitalism. It's baked into the capitalist pie, what Robert Fowler called interpassivity. The film performs our anti-capitalism for us so we don't have to, and we can continue with our consumerism with impunity. In the USSR, communism couldn't exist without propaganda, but capitalism can exist just fine and dandy with plenty of anti-capitalist propaganda. He quotes Zizek, who talks about how nowadays we're swimming in cynicism, but even if we use cynicism to cover our ears or close our eyes, we're still exercising ideological truths and ideology. The capitalist ideology we're exercising is that capitalism is bad, money is worthless tokens, and we disavow it. But our outward actions contradict our inner heart because we actually idolize money and participate in capitalism. Real anti-capitalist protest could not distinguish itself from anti-capitalist capitalism because it didn't present a clear vision of a complete replacement for it. Instead, it just seemed like a complaint of just the worst aspects of capitalism and just a bunch of protests with no political organization that were making crazy demands nobody actually expected to be fulfilled. The author writes that 2005's Live 8, which were a series of benefit concerts before the G8 summit, was a bunch of protests asking to legislate away poverty, which is like asking your dad to give you more allowance, as if the state could just legislate away poverty and hasn't just because it's selfish. But, he writes, it's the protests that need dad's allowance, not capitalism. He finishes the chapter by talking about Bono's Product Red, which is like a charity partnership, so supposedly like Apple can make red iPhones and use the Product Red logo if they give up to 50% of the sales to Bono's Product Red so that they can use the money to eliminate AIDS in Africa. That's the stated idea, at least. So Mark Fisher says that the idea behind the 1985 Live Aid was that individuals can end starvation directly with the help of other individuals and without political solutions or systematic organizations, purely through charitable acts and philanthropy. Bono's Product Red even tries to circumvent the charity and philanthropic idea and implies that capitalism can solve the problems without it even being a charitable act. Consumerism can solve starvation instead of it being the main cause of it. That thought was preposterous to Mark Fisher, and that's how he finishes the chapter. But I would answer, yeah, dude, capitalism has literally moved more people out of poverty than any other system. Look up the Chilean miracle, look up the Estonian miracle, look up the Hong Kong miracle, look up the Singapore miracle, the Taiwanese miracle, the Korean miracle, time and time again. These were the sweatshop countries. They were once colonized. They were like India and China are today. But those four countries, the four Asian tigers, achieved in 2 generations what it took the U.S. hundreds of years. These countries went from being replete with child prostitution to having a higher per capita GDP than the United States. and be in the top countries in terms of K through 12 educations. So yeah, dude, it's not that crazy of an idea. But I digress. In capitalist realism, when you criticize capitalism, your grievances will be dismissed. If you complain about the starving poor, you'll be told that that's just the cruel reality of life. And if you hope to improve it, you'll be painted as a dumb utopian dreamer. In order to threaten capitalism, you have to show it's untenable or inconsistent. Because for capitalism to succeed, it needs to be naturalized, or in my own words, be thought of as natural in the natural way of life. And it can't be thought of as natural if it's still thought of as a value, or in my own words, as a theory or ideology instead of a real thing that can be put in practice in the real world. He says that in the last 30 years, neoliberalism has eliminated the concept of value in the ethical sense, and has put it as a given that everything, healthcare, education, should be run as a business. But as Brecht, Foucault, and Bourdieu have pointed out, emancipatory politics, so political movements to free people, have to destroy the concept of a natural order. And they have to show people that what is sold to them as inevitable and necessary is actually optional and tangential. Conversely, at the same time, they have to make what seems impossible seem attainable. He then has a little quote which is really hard to understand, but the point is that you have to be skeptical the most of ideologies that present themselves as not ideological, but rather as facts. So again, to attack capitalist realism, to get rid of this nihilistic idea that there's no alternative to capitalism, you have to attack its fundamental assumptions. The best example is the environmental critiques. The ecological movement attacks the capitalist assumption that capitalism is forever sustainable, that capitalist expansion won't destroy the planet, and that the earth won't get destroyed with global warming. But, he says, the environmental argument is too politicized right now, so he wants less political examples like the mental health crisis. Again, if you bring up the mental health problem, your criticisms will be dismissed as caused by neurology and as just being the natural part of life. And so he reminds the reader that philosophers like Lang, Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari promoted extreme mental conditions like schizophrenia as not being natural, but rather a political category, so a result of politics. So he wants to take a page from their book and blame milder mental illnesses like depression on capitalism. He references that Oliver James guy, the guy he quotes a lot, as having found a correlation between a rise in capitalism and a rise of stuff like depression. And so he says we have to reframe the mental health crisis and start blaming politics. And also complains that treating depression has become a commodity. Again, the commoditization complaint. First of all, notice how he wrote that he didn't want to use the ecological argument because it's too politicized, and then tells people to politicize mental illness. But more importantly, he expounds more on this so-called link between capitalism and mental illness in Chapter 5. And spoiler alert, it's clearly fabricated. It's so unscientific. But anyways, his second example is about bureaucracy. Capitalism always criticized communism and the USSR because it was too bureaucratic. I mean, they did have huge stacks of paper to plan all the prices of all the goods and how many toothbrushes to produce. And under Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, you had to apply for a special license and write an essay every year justifying why you should own a typewriter. But he points out that bureaucracy has proliferated under capitalism. You know, because God forbid people get to work desk jobs in air-conditioned rooms where they can check their Facebook every once in a while, instead of toiling, planting potatoes all day, God forbid. But he clarifies the fact that bureaucracy persists is not a hard gotcha-style refutation of capitalism, but just pointing out that our perception of capitalism and the reality of capitalism are different. In case you can't tell, this chapter really angered me. Not just because he's so transparently trying to blame capitalism for the sky being blue, but above all, it angered me because all the pseudo-intellectual psychobabble could have been summarized in like 2 sentences. Hey man, to defeat capitalism, we have to show its inconsistencies, so like global warming, a rise in mental illness, and a rise in bureaucracy. That's all he had to say. Instead, he wrote such a belabored, convoluted mess. And don't come and tell me that that's what makes Nietzsche, all right? I also like how in the beginning of the chapter, he's like, yeah, dude, if you complain about starvation, which has literally been happening since the beginning of time, people dismiss you as a complainer. It's like saying, yeah, dude, if you have paint thinner and drive 120 miles an hour, people will call you reckless. Anyways, I'm off to huff paint thinner and get in my car. Like, just because you predict the counter-argument doesn't mean you're right. But I digress. Chapter 4. So this chapter is about his experience as a college teacher in the early 90s. It would make Gramsci proud. So from his experience, while French college students would protest neoliberalism, British students wouldn't, because of a sense of impotence. They were riddled with dyslexia and depression, not from not being able to get enough pleasure, but from not being able to pursue anything but pleasure. And so he references Deleuze's control society in the context of Kafka's novel The Trial. The Trial told of a legal system where the accused would never be fully acquitted. He would either have to be acquitted and then tried again some years later, or he would be found guilty and want to prolong his sentencing and delay it as much as possible. And likewise, in our control society, work is ever encroaching on our lives. Work never ends. Education is a lifelong process where people have to go back to college in old age, or training in your field has to persist your whole life, like a programmer who always has to learn the latest programming language to not become obsolete. And another example being working from home, especially after COVID, where the line between your work and after work life begins to blur. So from his experience in the classroom, Foucault said that discipline was manifested in the form of good posture. That was the sign they were under the control society. But now, students slouch, they eat snacks and talk during class. But even though they're rowdy in class, they're still under the control society. I'm going to pause the summary and comment here. Dude, stop moving the goalpost. So evidence of the control society is good posture and also the absence of good posture? It's just so annoying because it's another example where liberals are moving the goalpost. It's like if you're overtly racist, then you're a racist. But if you bend over backwards not to be racist, you're also racist. See, it's a catch-22. They always do this. But I digress. Anyways, moving on. From his experience as a teacher, colleges have a financial incentive to retain students. And so students knew that they wouldn't get kicked out of college for sloughing class or not turning in any work. But with this newfound freedom, the students wouldn't do anything good. They would just play PlayStation, watch TV all night, and smoke pot. From his experience teaching, even the straightest students found reading boring. And he says, quote, "What we're facing here is not just time-honored teenage torpor, but mismatch between a post-literate new flesh that is too wired to concentrate and the confining, concentrational logics of decaying disciplinary systems." End of quote. And I would say, no, genius, it's literally the age-old fact that teenagers find reading boring. I'm not a teenager, I have a booktube channel, and even I find it boring. It's boring. Again, blaming capitalism for the sky being blue. He quotes Deleuze and Guattari, quote, "Writing has never been capitalism's thing. Capitalism is profoundly illiterate." End of quote. And Fisher continues and goes on to even blame ADHD on capitalism's fault. It's not just correlation versus causation where we're diagnosing it better than ever. Nope, it's causing it, according to him. Continuing, teachers are forced to mediate between lightning speed entertainment with flashy ads and having to discipline kids, or as he put it, quote, "Teachers are now put under intolerable pressure to mediate between the post-literate subjectivity of the late capitalist consumer and the demands of the disciplinary regime," end of quote. But he makes this observation: his students weren't legally obligated to attend college. They did it because it was the easiest option at the lack of meaningful employment prospects. Quote, "Deleuze says that the control societies are based on debt rather than enclosure," end of quote. But the current system both encloses and indebts students. Get in debt to get the same job you would have without college. At this point, liberal communists don't believe capitalism can be overcome. At this point, they just think it should be offset with charity. But for them, this is an uphill battle because they're placed in a position where they have to resist change. They have to resist the new. He says, quote, "In any case, resistance to the new is not a cause the left can or should rally around." End of quote. Quote, "It is important to contest capitalism's appropriation of the new. But to reclaim the new can't be," end of quote, adapting to how the world is today in so many words. Quote, "Harvey demonstrates that in an era popularly described as post-political, class war has continued to be fought, but only by one side, the wealthy," end of quote. And then he concludes the chapter describing how inequality has increased and the rich have gotten richer. Note, though, he never says the poor got poorer, because it's a lie, and that's where the leftist criticism is wrong. Yes, the rich got richer, but the poor didn't get poorer. Don't let people fool you. The poor have consistently gotten richer under capitalism. But again, I digress. Chapter 5. He begins the chapter contrasting the old gangster movies like Goodfellas and The Godfather with the newer 1995 movie Heat. In Heat, the old country antiquity, the family ties, the Cosa Nostra moral code has been jettisoned by the urban sprawl of LA, by strangers with no moral code who share nothing in common except their pursuit of their next paycheck. These modern gangsters had to give up their family time, their wives had to get used to absent husbands and being on the move. As one wife in the movie Heat says, quote, "How do you expect to keep a marriage?" This parallels capitalism, that before, workers would learn one skill and use that to move upwards in their job hierarchy. But nowadays, people have to keep changing jobs and learning new skills, being on the move. Yeah, God forbid people diversify their resumes and make themselves more competitive, but I digress. The family structure is necessary in capitalism to reprise from the pressures of the world. But at the same time, capitalism puts pressure on family life. It puts financial strain on couples. It keeps parents away from their children. It's the result of the post-Fordism world. What is post-Fordism? Well, Marxist economist Christian Mirazzi says it's the world after October 6, 1979, when the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, creating the consumer economy in which we are. This raise in interest rates contained inflation and made possible a new economic organization. The rigid Ford assembly line model was done away with, and it brought a new flexibility. It made workers flexible, temporary, interchangeable, outsourced. In the old Fordist world, workers were divided in blue and white-collar jobs, and they could only communicate with each other during their breaks. Note, why is this communication tidbit important? Why did he add that? Why did he bring up such a random detail like they could talk during their breaks? Because for these Marxist postmodernists, communication, language, deconstructionism, that stuff is literally power. And so in this post-Fordist world, they're in a flux of information while at the same time having to be flexible, ready to upend their lives due to the just-in-time production model. And so, Mark Fisher goes on to say, it was easy for the opponents of labor unions to present themselves as the opponents of the labor union status quo, where they push fruitless ideologies that only serve labor union leaders and politicians, but not the labor union members. Workers are interested in the old-style conflicts, but now that they have a pension, they're also interested in having high yields in their stocks. And he references again Mirazzi, who researched the link between an increase in bipolar disorder and capitalism. And I kid you not, he explains that the market itself is bipolar, because like a bipolar person, they have a boom and bust cycle, ending in an economic, here it comes, depression. And so here's why. Here's why these leftists use such convoluted language, because if you were really to peel the onion and really understand what they're saying, you'd find that their arguments are based on puns. That's what he used as evidence, a pun, a literal pun. And he's not the first one or the last leftist who's going to use a pun. Oh, you go to the library to hear the lies. Yeah, that makes total sense. Panic, Hispanic, the word panic, it's racist. Like, they use puns way more frequently than anybody should. But I digress. And so here is the evidence, quoting from Oliver James, who he's always referencing, and I'll read it to you directly. Quote, for example, 16% of 36-year-old women in 1982 reported having trouble with nerves, feeling low, depressed, or sad, whereas 29% of 32-year-olds reported this in 2000. For men, it was 8% in 1982, 13% in 2000, end of quote. Quote, another British study James cites compared levels of psychiatric morbidity, which includes neurotic symptoms, phobias, and depression, in samples of people in 1977 and 1985, whereas 22% of the 1977 sample reported psychiatric morbidity. This had risen to almost a third of the population, 31%, by 1986. Since these rates are much higher in countries that have implemented what James calls selfish capitalism than in other capitalist nations, James hypothesizes that it is selfish, i.e. neoliberalized capitalism, policies, and culture that are to blame. End of quote. Well, that settles it. Case closed. That's irrefutable right there. So let's dissect what he wrote there. First of all, they, I guess, have a questionnaire that lumps trouble with nerves together with depression, which is problematic because they might have just noticed a spike, not in depression, but instead in trouble with nerves, which is in itself problematic because it's so vague. What does that even mean? And then the other one, they group together phobias with depression. So what's really rising there? Second, how's he measuring capitalism? Is he using the Heritage Economic Freedom Index? Is he using Cato's? Oh, wait, it's just that James dude's definition. It's totally arbitrary. He's the one who decides what he considers selfish capitalism. Does he consider Cambodia selfish capitalism? Is he even using other countries? How many other countries did he use? Did he include Guyana? Did he hire translators to translate Estonian mental illness stats? Or is he just measuring it in the UK? And how is he adjusting for the improvements in diagnoses and awareness of depression? This whole claim is so transparently BS. It's politically motivated propaganda. He didn't use the scientific method. What he did was come up with his conclusion and then try to get the facts to back it up. And that's how he ends the chapter. Oliver James believes the reason capitalism increases depression is because people are fed the lie that upwards mobility is accessible, and they too can become Bill Gates. So if they fail, it's because they have only one person to blame. And Fisher thinks employee reviews are the cause of this increase in depression. Again, this is why that quote from Ayn Rand is so relevant. What did we learn from this chapter? Did we learn that capitalism causes mental illness? Or did we learn that this guy is projecting his own opinion to blame capitalism for everything? He didn't do research. Again, he did me-search. Chapter 6. I actually agree with the spirit of this chapter because I've witnessed it myself. So he starts the chapter with a scene from the movie Office Space where the restaurant manager tells Jennifer Aniston, who plays the role of a waitress, that she needs to add more flares to her uniform so that she can express her individuality better. The moral of the story being that in capitalism, enough is no longer enough. Bureaucracy has come back into capitalism. Data points have become increasingly important. This takes the form of grade inflation to show better results in education, programmers being reviewed by their number of modules they write, and teachers having bureaucratic performance reviews with funding implications. The example of the teacher is a consequence of certain things in capitalism resisting marketization. In other words, the performance of workers in certain fields is hard to measure and quantify. In the field of education, are students the customers or are they the product? I personally don't think it's as complicated as he's making it out to be. There's 26 million service jobs out there. They seem to be doing fine, but I digress. And so he introduces us to the idea of market Stalinism, where symbols of achievement are more important than actual achievements. He has a great example in Stalinist Russia. Stalin ordered the construction of a White Sea Canal project, which was this huge canal that was built not deep enough to carry 20th century cargoes. All that could cross was tourist steamers. And so even though it didn't function, it had a huge public relations campaign. The parallel can be drawn with neoliberal politicians who set political targets every year that they don't fulfill. They emphasize the appearance of political change without actually achieving it. And I have no objection with that as far as it extends to politics. I agree with that. Now, the claim that capitalism relies on this is something different. Sure, as you'll see, he makes some valid points. He's not entirely wrong. But in free market capitalism, if a company doesn't meet its targets, aka doesn't bring in revenue, it goes out of business every single time. But I digress. Under market Stalinism and its obsession with data points and results, kids end up studying for the test, or in other words, just learning the stuff that will be on the test and nothing more and forgetting it right after. Under market Stalinism, hospitals waste money on unnecessary tests rather than just the essential operations. This market Stalinism is inherent in late capitalism because in capitalism, images and symbols are extremely important. For example, a good example I would say, the stock market value of companies are in big part set by how valued they appear to be. And also a good point, in capitalism everything devolves into PR and marketing. And at this point we're introduced to the concept of the big other, which Zizek explains is somebody who has to perceive a lie in order for a social reality to function. So in the previous example of Stalin's failed White Sea Canal, the big other are the tourists and reporters who would take pictures in the steamers, write articles about the canal, and spread the idea that the canal worked without knowing it didn't actually work. In capitalism, it is people who consume advertising that are their big other. They don't know the lie, they don't know the whole story. And it's the discrepancy between the people who are in the know and the big other that keeps the whole thing going. One of the biggest examples is a speech by Khrushchev delivered in 1965 in which he began to admit the shortcomings of communism. This was really momentous because it got rid of all the big others, and all that was left was people who were in the know of the lies of communism. Okay, so I'm going to read to you a quote and then explain it after. He wrote, quote, "Postmodernism can be construed as the name for the complex of crises that the decline in the belief in the big other has triggered. As Lyotard's famous formulation of the postmodern condition, incredulity towards meta-narratives, which is a fancy way of saying postmodernism is the crisis that we live in now after we've become skeptical or distrustful of all our meta-narratives. So in other words, we stopped believing in God. We learned God doesn't exist. We learned that cops can be corrupted and are selling drugs. We learned that science was used to create mustard gas. Inevitably, it was its inevitable goal. We learned that the concentration camps were designed by Harvard graduates, and the result of modern science, nuclear science, was the atomic bomb. We learned that American soldiers sometimes kill innocent children. And so we learned all these meta-narratives were false, and we went through a bunch of crises, and so we're living in a state of postmodernism. We have destroyed the big other because, like after Khrushchev's speech, nobody can claim ignorance to these modern atrocities. That's one definition of capitalist realism, quote, the claim to have given up belief in the big other. So not only are we aware of these atrocities, but we think everyone is aware of these atrocities. Nobody has any excuse. At this point, he mentions a cyberpunk work of fiction, I don't know, a short story, a book, I can't remember, but it was by a guy named Nick Land. This story takes place in a sort of pure capitalism run by AI. The artificial intelligence is not a centralized planner. Remember that. It's not central planning. It is decentralized. It's a network that relies heavily on feedback loops. So they adjust based on information fed back to it. Okay, it's decentralized. And so because capitalism in this fictional world is run by AI, there is no need for marketing, there's no need for PR campaigns, and therefore there's no big other to perceive the lies of capitalism. In this fictional story, the AI slowly erodes the role of government and slowly unmasks capitalism by getting rid of advertising and marketing, and brings about a sort of pure capitalism where the only thing stopping its progress is, quote, forces of anti-production as opposed to internal problems. But Mark Fisher's point is that real life wouldn't work like that. According to him, a pure form of capitalism wouldn't slowly unmask capitalism. To the contrary, PR and marketing's whole purpose is to add a mask to capitalism. And PR and marketing are essential for capitalism to run efficiently, how it's supposed to. Capitalism moving to a purer form would mask it even more. And also, he says that if you take away the forces of anti-production, capitalism will disappear too. He references Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism's Unnameable Thing, where they argue that anti-production and reterritorialization is what makes up capitalism. I think by anti-production, he's referencing like the White Sea Canal, all the failures of capitalism that we know are BS, but we pretend like we don't know are BS to keep it going. Because the whole point of the paragraph that he's trying to make is this. As we said before, real existing socialism relied on that discrepancy between the big other and the people in the know for it to exist, right? Okay, so real existing capitalism also needs this discrepancy in order to exist. In capitalism, companies have to be presented as socially responsible and caring. And meanwhile, people have to know that they're really corrupt and ruthless. Remember how earlier I said capitalist realism is giving up the belief in the big other? And mentioned Lyotard's formulation of postmodern conditioning being incredulity towards meta-narratives? Well, his point is that what he calls capitalist postmodernism is not as skeptical and incredulous to the stories, aka meta-narratives of capitalism, as we think. There's still some leeway there. For example, there was a jeweler named Gerald Ratner who during an after-dinner speech said that his jewelry shops were selling crap. He called it crap. And after saying that, his company lost 500 million pounds of value. Why? Because the big other came in the know, and because capitalism relies on the gap between the big other and the people in the know, and because capitalist postmodernity is not as incredulous, in other words skeptical, of the meta-narratives as we think. Now I'm going to read to you the most annoyingly confusing paragraph I read in the whole book. It's so hard to understand. I reread it multiple times and had to look up Zizek's original quote to get what he's trying to say. So I'm going to read it to you, and then after I'm going to explain it in plain English. But it's okay if you can't follow along because I'm going to explain it, okay? Be patient. Vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis of symbolic efficiency in a far less intense way than Nick Land, through metafictional anxieties about the function of the author, and in television programs or films which expose the mechanisms of their own productions and reflexively incorporate discussions of their own status as commodities. But postmodernism's supposed gestures of domestication do not evidence sophistication so much as a certain naivety, a conviction that there were others in the past who really believed in the symbolic. In fact, of course, symbolic efficiency was achieved precisely by maintaining a clear distinction between a material empirical causality and another incorporeal causality proper to the symbolic. Okay, want to know what that gobbledygook means? Okay, so as far as I can tell, symbolic efficiency is symbolic efficacy, how fiction shapes our experience of reality. And as far as I can tell, vernacular postmodernism is postmodernism as it relates to vernacular. So in other words, as it relates to words and communication. So I take it to mean stories like books, like commercials that tell you this detergent will make your husband love you, or movies where Linda Carter has superpowers and knows kung fu. I say this because he says vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis of symbolic efficiency, with self-referential fictional works like books that break the fourth wall and bring up what the author of the book meant. And he says that vernacular postmodernism, so remember, postmodernism as it relates to movies and TVs, has dealt with the fiction's depiction by having the Oscars be an award show and having college courses on filmmaking and documentaries and DVD featurettes deconstruct how movies are made. So in other words, vernacular postmodernism is when a postmodernist comes to you and says, hey, you know, Linda Carter is just an actress who really doesn't know kung fu in the real world. And that detergent commercial is trying to manipulate you with sexism. And Rock Hudson is not really a cowboy, and he doesn't know how to aim a gun. Look at him at this award show getting an award for acting. That's what vernacular postmodernism has done. Nick Land, on the other hand, was like, the way to be above fiction's deception is with AI taking over capitalism and getting rid of the human choice, and therefore getting rid of all the advertising and PR campaigns and lies of capitalism by getting rid of the human involvement in it. That's my best guess as to what it means. But the whole point of that paragraph, at least if we go by the next paragraph and sort of the conclusion of the paragraph, the whole point Mark Fisher is trying to make is this. By postmodernism trying to blow everyone's minds and make them cynical about society's meta-narratives and society's symbols, they sort of overdid it. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. It's kind of like him saying, yeah, we should be cynical of meta-narratives and there is no such thing as a truth claim and all that. But let's not overdo it, guys. There's something to symbols. As he put it, postmodernism's supposed demystification is not sophisticated, it's naive. Because postmodernists thought that back in the day, people really couldn't distinguish the blur between Rock Hudson the cowboy and Rock Hudson the actor, or couldn't distinguish the line between a detergent that will kind of clean your clothes and a detergent that will make your husband love you more, or couldn't distinguish the line. Well, this is his example. The line between a judge being the representative of the justice system and a judge, the imperfect man who's only human. The point is, if you try to show people reality, but if you don't include the symbolism, then you're not showing them the real truth. And so symbolic efficiency was achieved precisely by people distinguishing between the tangible and intangible too harshly. In other words, just trusting only what we can see with our eyes too much. So he references Zizek, who explains this better, I think. So the example is that you see a judge walk in and start getting all cynical about it, saying to yourself, our culture tells me the judge represents the law, but in reality my eyes tell me that he's a weak man who doesn't deserve my respect. And Zizek references Lacan, who points out that if you trust too much on what you can see with your eyes and cynically ignore the symbol, then you're missing something. That something is the symbolic efficiency. Yeah, the judge is just human, but he's still a judge. When he wears his robe and bangs the gavel, there's something to that. Baudrillard points out that fly-on-the-wall documentaries present reality, but might also be changing it, which makes true reality always escape our reach. Are people acting differently because of the cameras? Likewise, polls present reality, but may be affecting it. Did people vote differently because of the polls? We'll never know, and therefore reality is always fleeting. Add to this reality shows like Big Brother, where these two things, polls and documentaries, are mixed. Because back then, you could vote via text message. And this creates a type of cybernetic feedback where the people in the documentaries change their behavior because of the polls. These kinds of cybernetic feedbacks are integral to delivering services like education and government. And voila, he's back to talking about education. But I digress. And so this brings us back to the post-Fordism bureaucracy, which is obsessed with data points and feedback and the relationship between the bureaucracy and the big other. What are we talking about? The relationship between bureaucracy and the big other? Well, we've all seen it. It's the low-level employee who shrugs responsibility, the cashier, the secretary. That's not up to me. I'll take it up with the manager. It's not me, I'm afraid. It's the rule. In all these cases, the low-level employee can't make decisions for themselves. They can only refer to decisions that have already been made by the big others. Sorry, sir, that's how we do it here. Well, why? Because that's how it's always been done. Quote, deferrals of responsibility is all that the big other is. End of quote. By the way, I think he's changing the definition of the big other under our feet, but whatever, let's go with it. Zizek claimed that the Soviet system was an empire of signs, where everyone was trying to interpret complex series of social semiotic signals. Now, the Soviet Union was a controlled, planned economy with big government. And so what happens in capitalism when there is no final word, when there is no grand manager? Who can tell you the answer? Well, then, in that instance, the instructions gain a life of their own, like in the following example. So there was once a meeting between trade union officials, college principals, and members of parliament. They all met up and encountered a set of directives none of them could interpret. These directives weren't being demanded by the government policy itself, so nobody knew why they were there, and so they interpreted these instructions, thereby giving these instructions a life of their own. Nobody knew where they came from or why, and so they assumed a type of resistance to being amended or questioned because nobody knew why they were there, so nobody wanted to question them. The idea that the big others have been eliminated in capitalism is false, or at the very least exaggerated, because of the fusion between PR and bureaucracy. In other words, things like colleges use their bureaucratic test scores to promote their university in PR campaigns. Likewise, McDonald's will use its metrics of hamburger sales as advertisement. 1 billion hamburgers sold. Or maybe more applicable, they'll use it to appease their shareholders. Or in other words, the big others still exist in late capitalism. In Mark Fisher's experience as a teacher, the school had him and his co-workers evaluate their own behavior. Similarly to Kafka's The Trial, the workers became their own perpetual inspector. So the workers always on trial, like in Kafka's story, forever, never-ending, perpetually. Foucault, in Discipline and Punishment, said there's no need for surveillance. All you have to do is tell people you're going to surveil them. The anticipation alone of surveillance makes people surveil themselves. And as Fisher points out, there are fields in capitalism that are really hard to inspect. Quote, "The result is a kind of postmodern capitalist version of Maoist confessionalism, in which workers are required to engage in constant symbolic self-denigration," end of quote. Mark Fisher's own boss, who told him and his coworkers their departmental logbooks weren't self-critical enough. But not to worry, because any self-criticism is just symbolic and will never be acted upon. Quote, "As if performing self-flagellation as part of a purely formal exercise in cynical bureaucratic compliance were any less demoralizing," end of quote. Quote, "DeAngelis and Harvey report that practices and requirements of standardization and surveillance obviously impose a huge burden of work on academics, and a few are happy about it," end of quote. One lecturer sardonically remarked, "Seems more impossible than ending slavery was." So they were told by their boss to work smarter, not harder, and he took it as a sign of how capitalist realism sets the tone for labor disputes in post-Fordism. I mean, let me laugh at this dude. Give me a break. Why is he complaining so much? Like, his boss is like, work smarter, not harder, and he sulks away at a keyboard writing in a blog about labor disputes in post-Fordism? Teachers are the laziest people ever. They work until 3 p.m. They get summers free. I bet you money he used to check his Facebook at work. Give me a break, dude. Like, you're not in the salt mines of Mali. Geesh. You, the listener, you're probably employed and you know he's acting butthurt about nothing. Like, we all go through it. And again, this is a revelation of this dude's psychology more than anything else. Boy, these postmodernists sure love coining new terms. Like, a normal person would just be like, yeah, scams can't go on if people know they're scams. But these postmodernists instead are like, capitalist realism is when we lose the belief in the big others. And did you notice how he changed the definition of the big others mid-chapter? Postmodernism is a prank. It's the longest running scam built on a mountain of scams. Now, having said those criticisms, I do agree with the spirit of the chapter. From my experience in my last 3 jobs, I saw managers just completely pull numbers out of thin air in terms of yearly performance reviews. One of my managers gave a presentation to his higher-ups of how we had saved the company $1 million. I remember his voice cracked during the presentation, and it was so transparently BS because the entire year we hadn't delivered anything of value. I remember at my last job, they gave us a goal to, well, without giving any personal details away, let's say I work at a dog walking business. So they gave us a goal to walk 100 dogs in a week. I calculated that it takes about 1 day for me to walk 1 dog. Well, after the first day, we already had more than half our goal met. And it was partly because we were counting dogs we had walked in the past, and partly because we walked cats and called them dogs. So I like that he articulated, actually no, he didn't articulate it, he obfuscated it. But I like that he kind of mentions this phenomenon of BS at least. Chapter 7. Being realistic in capitalism means conforming to a fungible, ever-changing plastic reality. He gives the example of a manager who has to pretend like he doesn't care about performance reviews but still enforces them. And he references a book named The Lathe of Heaven, where a character's dreams always come true. He dreams of overpopulation going away and wakes up with billions having died. If a reality is unbearable, then our escapist dreams are inconsistencies. But the difference between Kant, Nietzsche, and Freud, and the phrase life is but a dream, is that the dreams we come up with are consensual, meaning they console us rather than disturb us. In the story of The Lathe of Heaven, the character finally ends up accepting the new dream world as the real one. And so, in a world where existence is iffy, forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy, aka a coping mechanism. Mark Fisher gives the example of a guy named Gordon Brown who tried to reinvent himself by attempting to get everyone who knew him to forget his past. He made up a lie about his mother being a businesswoman. Likewise, the political party he was a member of also had to completely rebrand itself. Mark Fisher also references Jason Bourne, who lacks narrative memory but retains formal memory. So he can't remember the narrative of his past, but he can remember karate moves. Our culture longs for nostalgia, unable to create anything new under the sun. But also, our culture has a short attention span and news stories that only matter for a week or so and are then forgotten, erased from our memory. Oliver James wrote that we have to work from a paradox of a constantly changing, rapid-paced world, with a huge amount of conformity and standardization. Wendy Brown wrote an essay about how neoliberalism and neoconservatism are contradictory and inconsistent. Neoliberalism is without morals, cheapens life, and exploits desire, while neoconservatism tries to preserve, conserve, and regulate morality. Notwithstanding these inconsistencies, Brown argues that neoconservatism and neoliberalism work together to undermine the public sphere and democracy by creating citizens who look to find solutions in products and not in political processes. So Mark Fisher takes the liberty of extrapolating from her words that the cooperation of neoliberalism and neoconservatism has the goal of opposing the nanny state and its dependence. He says neoliberalism in reality is not opposed to the state per se because they took bailouts in 2008, but rather particular uses of state funds. Meanwhile, neoconservatism says they want small government, but really want a strong state when it comes to military and police functions. I think the beginning of the chapter is about how our rapidly changing world is rewriting the past. I don't know how it ties to the rest of the chapter and the hypocrisy between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Maybe neoconservatism trying to retain the past and neoliberalism trying to forget the past. I racked up my brain trying to make sense of it. But again, this is written in postmodernist language. We should stop reading too much into it. It's a prank. Chapter 8. Whenever the government gives away its power to private companies and the private sector fails the people blame the government for giving its power away. Like in the case of flooding due to water companies / house builders, and in the case of bank failures of 2008, he called it deflection. The closest we come to this concept of deflection is when you call a call center, right? A call center being a place that's a Kafkaesque labyrinth, a world without memory, where it is a miracle if anything actually gets done. It is the embodiment of capitalist deflection, and yet nobody blames capitalism for it. Kafka was ahead of his time when he wrote The Castle. Mark Fisher then explains, or rather purposefully doesn't explain, Campbell Jones's philosophical paper, The Subject Supposed to Recycle, which is about how a categorical imperative like recycling, which everyone must do, takes some of the personal responsibility away. Because you're not telling people you should recycle, you're saying everyone must recycle, which puts the mental image of other people in your head. Judith Butler applied it to global warming, where we need a collective effort to stop global warming, but the collective doesn't exist. So in this chapter, Mark Fisher uses the movie The Parallax View as the explanation for all this deflection, this shrugging of responsibility, this call center. The movie The Parallax View is about an evil conspiracy made up of a bunch of people, without a single leader, headless, impersonalized, without any consequences for the individual villains. Again, like a call center without any employees taking responsibility for anything. That's what late capitalism is to him. The banking crisis was so systemic that nobody can be held responsible. Does anyone really believe that banking would improve if we replace everyone with better people? Of course not. It's a structural problem. And even corporations are constrained by the ultimate cause that is not a subject, the ultimate headless conspiracy, the ultimate puppeteer behind the shadows, capital. Now, I would disagree with him on this, okay, because we know what caused the housing bubble. We know what caused the 2008 banking crisis, mortgage-backed securities. And we know the names of the guys who created them back in the 70s. We know that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were specifically created by the government to extend credit to people who should not have gotten in debt. We know the names of the Fed chairman who kept interest rates artificially low for so long. Like, it's all in the book, The Big Short. It's an amazing book. Like, doesn't the fact that Michael Burry predicted the housing crisis prove that there's a specific cause, which proves that it's not a headless conspiracy? Maybe it's costless to him, maybe. Maybe it's a magical black box to him, but not to economists. But I digress. Chapter 9. So this is the chapter where, after describing the problem for 8 chapters, he tells us his advice on how to solve the problem of capitalist realism. For the final chapter, he references the reality show Super Nanny, where the underlying motif of the show is that the problem is not in the bratty kids, it's in the parents being bad parents. Well, we have a problem because in our capitalist society, increasingly, literally parents, okay, not figurative parents, but literally both parents have to work in capitalism. Capitalism needs families to be together, but discourages parents from spending time with their kids. This causes a paradoxical problem. For a solution of the problem, he references Zizek, who mentions Spinoza's account of the fall of Adam. So in Spinoza's account, God forbade Adam to eat the apple because the apple was going to hurt him. In other words, an act is wrong not because Daddy says so. Daddy only says it's wrong because performing the act will be harmful to us. In other words, because kids are raised without a dad, they need to replace the advice of their missing father with common sense. Anti-smoking campaigns and TV suggest we're already in a paternalism without the father world. You can say that again, but I digress. But here's the trick. To tell people how to lose weight or how to decorate their house is acceptable, but to call for any kind of cultural improvement is to be oppressive and elitist, end of quote. And so, quote, the media class's refusal to be paternalistic has not produced a bottom-up culture of breathtaking diversity, but one that is increasingly infantilized, end of quote. According to Adam Curtis, the Wild West of the internet has created a bunch of echo chambers where people detach themselves from society. Our fatherless paternalism society has created the internet, which allows populist currents on both the left and the right to bully media producers into turning out programming that is anodyne and mediocre, end of quote. By the way, I never knew that Mark Fisher referenced Adam Curtis in his book. It's funny because Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization and his subsequent ones have been heavily influenced by this book. Clearly, they're both filleting each other, but whatever. Quote, the reason that focus groups and capitalist feedback systems fail, even when they generate commodities that are immensely popular, is that people do not know what they want, end of quote. What they want can only be supplied by artists and media professionals who are prepared to give people something different from that which already satisfies them. By those, that is to say, prepared to take a certain kind of risk. The Marxist super nanny would not only be the one who laid down limitations, who acted in our own interests when we are incapable of recognizing them ourselves, but also the one prepared to take this kind of risk, to wager on the strange and our appetite for it. Case in point, quote, it was the public service-oriented BBC and Channel 4 that perplexed and delighted me with the likes of Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy, Pinter Place, and Tarkovsky seasons. It was this BBC that also funded the popular avant-gardism of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which embedded sonic experimentalism into everyday life, end of quote. Ooh, how avant-garde. See, you guys, I'm sorry, but I have to admit, capitalism has been refuted by him. I mean, have you heard of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy? I mean, have you seen it? This is so myopic. What an elitist piece of crap this guy is. Stop liking what I don't like, you guys. You're all acting like Philistines. Try some sonic experimentalism for a change. God. Okay, so here's his solution. Are you ready? The left should stop limiting its ambitions to the establishing of a big state. But distancing from the state doesn't mean abandoning the state or retreating into the private sector. Quote, the goal of a genuinely new left should not be to take over the state, but to subordinate the state to the general will, resuscitating a general will and having a public space that can't be reduced to individualism. What a new idea! The state should represent the will of the people. Why didn't every single Democrat think of that before? Quote, in a disintegrated social sphere in which teenagers shooting each other has become commonplace, in which hospitals incubate aggressive superbugs, what is required is that effect be connected to structural cause, end of quote. And voila, there it is. It's a structural problem that the sky is blue. So we must change the structure and, let me guess, put intellectual elites like this guy in charge? By the way, did you catch that superbug thing? Okay, Mark, give us some examples of the will of the people. Quote, for example, the left should argue that it can deliver what neoliberalism signally failed to do, end of quote. Okay, what is it? Quote, a massive reduction of bureaucracy. With a rejection of excessive auditing, they should stop giving strikes to teachers, and they have to get rid of self-auditing. Again, this guy can't stop using his job as an example. Quote, instead of gestural spectacular politics around noble causes like Palestine, it's time that teaching unions got far more eminent and take the opportunity opened up by the crisis to begin to rid public services of business ontology, end of quote. Again, this guy can't stop himself. He's just saying teacher unions should stop talking about subjects that don't concern them and should instead fight to get rid of private businesses existing in public services like education. That's all it meant. Why can't he just say it like that? And finally, quote, "We must convert widespread mental health problems from medicalized conditions into effective antagonisms," end of quote. And don't forget, the ecological angle is the strongest argument against capitalism because remember, quote, "Neoliberalism has already been completely uncredited," end of quote. There you have it. That's the detailed summary of the book. I can't help myself from quoting Ayn Rand in this instance when she wrote in The Virtue of Selfishness, "Socialism is not a movement by the people. It is a movement of the intellectuals led and carried by them. They purport to defend the interest of the public, but the public is an identifiable group, so it'll always be the public says moi." So I hope you guys enjoyed my summary. Believe it or not, I censored out all my swearing. It was truly a hate read for me, but he made a few good points. Rest in peace, King. Thank you guys for listening. Please subscribe if you liked it. I'm in the process of wrapping up a script for Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. Like in this book, I'm going to discuss it and give it a summary of it. I've worked on that script for a long time, and I've really polished it. I'm very proud of that script. And I'm also working on a video on Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. And I'm going to be criticizing it. I'm not going to. I don't want to give the impression that I'm impartial because, as you guys can probably tell, I'm very partial. But I do criticize that book a little bit. Then after that, I'm planning on a video about The Mayflower, written by Nathaniel Philbrick. A great book, but I'm planning a Devil's Advocate defense on the Pilgrims. Also, I have out a video discussing the book The Idiot by Dostoevsky. It's my most popular video, so check it out if you haven't. So please subscribe, and if nothing else, thanks for listening.